Hello and welcome to the Mobile GameDev Playbook. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. This is the podcast all about what makes a great mobile game, what is and isn't working for mobile game designers, and all of the latest trends. I'm your host, John Jordan, and in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the value of brand licensing and how you can go about doing it, and the sort of challenges, opportunities, and issues. So we have an all-star cast to talk about that. So into introductions. So first up, we have Ratchet Motti, who is from CEO of Layer Licensing. How's it going, Ratchet?
Very well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Yes, good. Looking forward to this. And you're going to be approaching it. You have a sort of platform. We'll get into the details of what you're doing there, but that you're sort of enabling brands and developers and content creators to sort of come together. And also, I guess more from the content creators side, we have Asi Barak, who is the Chief Business Officer at Tilting Point. How's it going, Asi?
Good, thank you. Excited to be here with you.
Good. And making sure we pick up all the trends. We have our expert, Kalle Helkinen, who's analyst at Game Refinery by Liftoff. How's it going, Kalle?
Very good, John. How about you?
Good. So let's crack on. I mean, I guess we'll do some bit more sort of detailed introductions. I mean, Ratchet, I guess you are the sort of startup in the space, so maybe spend a bit of time. What is Layer Licensing? What are you doing? What's the vision? What problem are you solving for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Great question. Layer is a marketplace that helps publishers and developers work with IP. So we're an IP licensing marketplace. What that means is whether you've got a game that's live and in market, and you might want to look at content integrations to work with popular characters or automotive brands or consumer goods that people already know and love for in-game integration. That's one way of looking at it. All the way through to getting the rights to make a licensed game around an IP or a film or TV series. So that space has historically been something that is a little hard for every publisher or developer to have access to. It requires a lot of resources, and it's generally something that sits towards the top of the market. The really big publishers, play in this space, and we're trying to make that easier for every other developer and publisher through our marketplace.
And I guess as a opening point, Asi, I mean, Tilting Point worked with lots of big brands over the years. I guess SpongeBob is one that sort of springs to mind. But I guess with your content creator hat on, where does licensing sit for you guys? Is it a big problem? Is it? I mean, clearly, from my sort of top-down view, it would look like they're becoming more important, not less important over time. Is that broadly correct?
Yeah. Not only that it's becoming more important over the years, in the area of licensing, you build reputation with licensors. So you actually build, year over year, you build a stronger network and stronger opportunities. And I would say that IP is actually a superpower for Tilting Point in terms of what we can offer our partners and what we can do in the market. I think with Web3, IP is going to be super powerful. I think that in IDFA era, it's more important. So, yeah, I think the future of licensing is secure.
I guess most of us can understand now sort of the baseline of what you're trying to do. There are brands who are happy to go into games and obviously want to generate revenue from that. And there are lots of pretty much every game developer now, I guess, is at least interested in the potential for that. So you're bringing together these things on a marketplace. But it's interesting, I guess what Asi was saying there is while you're taking friction out of that, maybe that's not the key issue in these sort of license negotiations, which is a bit more about reputation. So can you talk a bit about how you? I mean, obviously you are doing sort of nuts and bolts of bringing people together, but it's just not. It's much more than that to be successful, isn't it?
We want more and more developers and publishers to be able to play like Tilting Point. Like Tilting Point has this stellar track record of SpongeBob, Warhammer, Narcos, so many, right? And I think in the way we do it and what we help that process kind of like, and how we help simplify that is, unless you've done it, it's hard to get a read on what does that even entail. Who do you speak to? How do you figure out how much anything costs, or what the process around kind of approvals or going through a licensing contract even looks like. And so our platform, initially obviously starts to focus on matchmaking and discovery and making sure that people can identify who's a fit, and then we go down that later stage approach of, well, how do we make these deals come together better? How do we, through the platform, how do we make sure that comments are moving back and forth? Make sure that we have standardized ways of working together legally through kind of standard like licensing contracts and those kinds of things. And then, of course, there's an element of making sure that we help the developers or the publishers articulate, like, why is this a fit for the IP? Like, why is this, something that's going to make sense for the fans and the audience? And there's a huge trust element, right? It's the brand licensor or the IP holder essentially is the guardian of that that franchise or that narrative, and if you're licensing it, you're by extension saying that you're going to protect it too, and work with it in the right way. And so over time, I think the more licensing exposure anyone has, and the more we can help them kind of move through that, the bigger those licenses are that people can work with, and the more frequently they can start doing that. But I think it takes time to be able to do what Tilting Point's doing.
So if I'm like an indie developer, I've made some games, interested in what's going on, how do I sort of access your platform? What are sort of the early steps?
I mean, the early steps for Layer are really, really simple. I mean, it's you go on our website, Layer Licensing, you can sign up. It gets you into the product, and essentially we ask the questions around tell us about your games, tell us about your audience, what are you interested in, commercially what's viable as well, because in this space, there's no point trying to reach out to a Lucasfilm type if your game's really small and it's not even the right genre fit, and it's not going to be thematically in line with what they're doing. So we help the developers there express what are they after. Where might be making puzzle games, we might be targeting US audience, we might already know that our audience is skewing 25 to 45 female, for example. And so by taking all of that in and knowing what commercials might work for them, our system pushes them IP that actually overlaps with that audience. It's IP that will resonate with those players. And so that's really important to make sure that we don't just kind of apply any random brand or IP, because that's probably where we see failures in market. People have done kind of, I guess, what people call IP slapping or label slapping. And to avoid that, you can really try and find the overlaps between your audience and the IP audience. And we try and, go down that route. But the early stages of signing up to Layer are really just, using the platform and setting up a profile and saying what you're after. And the platform kind of does the rest of it.
My first impression was, developers turn up and sort of, it's such a big world of all these IPs, and there's sort of there'll be a whole bunch out there. But how do you sort of find out the ones that you don't know that they're the ones you need to be talking to? And it sounds like this audience, the idea of crossover between audience is sort of great, because you can go, I've got this game, and you might find, and I've got a lot of players in this sort of like part of the world, and you might find something potentially quite a local IP that you've never heard of. But that's it's like an IP discovery mechanic obviously going on there.
Totally, and I think that's the thing. Like both ways, really. If you think about it, like no one can know every IP that's out there and know where the audience is going to be right for you. And similarly, not every licensor knows every game out there, right? Like no one knows the audiences that are out there available to work with from the licensor side as well. So yeah, that discovery element, I mean, historically has been really, really tricky, and we try and change that as much as we can.
When you think about sort of your licensing, how does that work from sort of your content creator point of view? I mean, obviously, I guess on a top down level, if you're working with is certain things you do with sort of SpongeBob and certain things you do with Warhammer, so that sort of falls out more sort of logically, I guess. But can you give us some examples of how you sort of thought about that?
We have a unique position of a publisher, right, versus a developer that owns a game, and that's mostly maybe one title or a couple. The way we think about content and the way we think about IP match is really coming from an engine. That's our perspective. So, we basically over the years aggregate a large number of engines. Nowadays it's 40, and some of them we outright own as first party, but some of them are third party deals that we're doing with developers. And the idea of an engine is that, at least from our very risk averse approach, it needs to be something that is already proven without an IP. So it's scalable, it monetizes, and then the IP, if it's a good match, of course, is going to do two very simple things. One is it's going to be to bring organic traffic, but even more importantly, if it's done well, it's going to lower the cost per install, the CPI. That will allow the same engine that was successful at X, with IP be 3 to 5X. So we basically base the IP product on a previous success that only amplifies what was done before. Obviously, I'm shortcutting. It's still a big effort to match the IP and make the new game and make sure that the values are kept and all that. But that's kind of the high level thinking about it.
Because I guess that's from a commercial point of view, one of the issues with IP is obviously you're giving away a cut of revenue because that's you're getting someone else's IP. So you have to be, I guess, very clearly aligned that you're just not doing it because it's sort of cool within the company to do a Star Wars or something. I mean,
as I said, when I'm thinking about the amplification of whether it's 3x, 5x, and it allows me to run much more user acquisition profitably, that needs to be much higher than the pie, the part of the pie that I'm giving away to the licensor. That should be the principle.
Kalle, do we want to coming to you from a sort of a trend point of view? What are we seeing in terms of your market analysis of how IP is being used?
It's really interesting that if we look at new games launched, for example, in the last year that have found sustained success in the top 200 grossing, there's actually 4 games: Diablo, Marvel Snap, Dislight, and then the Office Idle game. And Dislight is the only one out of these that doesn't use an IP. So it's extremely hard to launch a new game now and make it to the top, but it's even harder if you're not using an IP. But if you're not making an IP-based game, obviously there are other ways as well to leverage an external IP, most notably collaboration crossover events. And in this field, especially, we see very exciting things happening all the time. So if we look at some Game Refinery data, we can see that in Japan, collaboration events have been very popular for a long time. Currently, 68% of the top 200 games are utilizing those. In the West, they're increasing as well nowadays. 32% of top 200 grossing games utilize some sort of collaboration events. And then on the trend side there, we see collaboration events becoming more innovative, bigger in scale, bigger in production values, and so forth. And they also last longer. For example, the event with The Walking Dead and State of Survival lasted for 6 months. Now we have a very exciting Cookie Run BTS event going on that is it's still going on, but it will last for 100 days. And then one more thing is that the spectrum of IPs is also practically exploded. And nowadays you can see very interesting combinations like Cristiano Ronaldo in Garena Free Fire or Gucci in Pokemon Go. And speaking of Gucci, I think one trend that is quite visible is how we're seeing more and more of these fashion brands in games like Ralph Lauren in Fortnite, Burberry in Minecraft, and Louis Vuitton in League of Legends. And it really makes sense especially with these games with these big cosmetic economies. So those are the big things that we're seeing from our perspective in the market when it comes to the IP stuff.
I think the biggest change over the last few years isn't that IPs and licenses are getting more valuable. It's how they're being used, and it's not making a game around a single IP. Although clearly that is still that's something that's increased a lot. But as live ops has become sort of the lifeblood of sort of free to play mobile industry, the ability to get brands in for limited periods of time is probably now crucial. But I guess coming back to what you're doing with Layer, these are quite sort of in a sense kind of small limited sort of periods of time that you need to have some efficiency in doing those deals because you're not making a whole game based on Gucci or something. You're just having Gucci in for a few months. So I guess that's sort of where Layer really plays into how the industry is changing because you're reducing the friction. So people might be doing 5 or 6 branded events a year, and they can do that much quicker through a marketplace than sort of having to phone people up or go to conferences and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was the bet at the kind of the start of what we were seeing in the market when we started Layer, in that live ops exploded in general. I think the mobile, the game industry in general started incorporating events and live ops more and more, and we figured IP is such an interesting space that, to do more of those deals, we need to see if there's an easy way of doing that. And I think now in this kind of post IDFA world, that's becoming even more important for a lot of companies to make sure that they can run a pipeline of kind of ongoing content that attracts players in ways that they couldn't before. So yeah, that kind of pipeline of events, live ops space is really important. And I think on the licensor side, that's becoming more known to them as well. I think, that has taken a little while to understand that, on their end, they've previously gone, well, what kind of game are you going to make around our IP, which a lot of the time is really successful. And us, you would know with so many licensed games out there, but they're also now coming to understanding that, oh, we as a licensor, as an IP, can actually work in multiple games and actually think about this and build a slate for our IPs to be across the market at different times in different, markets and geographies and different genres. The players in a hardcore game seeing your IP there may not be cannibalizing, or maybe a completely different set to those in a hyper casual that are seeing your IP in a different country 6 months later. So there's ways of making that easier for them to understand as well, and that is something that we think is on the up.
All these trends are pushing in the same direction, and it seems like most IP holders are now much more, for the reasons you sort of said, but I think more generally as well, much more open to not being so precious about what they've got, because now there are so many channels, not just in games, but clearly sort of brands are sort of everywhere. And it's all previously, certainly when it games, you'd have like there can only be one game at a time, or it's an exclusive license or something like that. Whereas now, even with the biggest licenses, the Marvels and the Star Wars, there's multiple games all the time. Some of them are sort of actually quite similar in genre, but the licensor just says, well, we're not going to pick or choose winners. You guys do it, which I guess is sort of, I mean, can we still have sort of brand overkill? I don't know, Assi, I'll ask you. Would there be some brands where you just go, I just can't see how this adds up, because there's literally so many games, there's 10 games out a year with this brand. That's, that just doesn't work.
Yeah, you do see it, even though I think that even those that we saw it kind of retweak, rechange their strategy, and they saw that it actually dilutes the brand. And again, in extreme cases that they do, unlike what Rakit talked about, they're doing it with the same audience, with the same genre, again and again. It's not helpful, and they see it eventually. What I did want to add to the mix here about being able to work with a lot of brands, but also different audiences in different places. Another thing that we help our partners with, our developer partners, is to get to platforms that are not free to play. And their IPs also make a big difference. So there are new platforms coming in. Some of them are already have history, like Apple Arcade of 3 years. Those subscription platforms behave very differently than free to play. They still could be very lucrative. I mean, at Tiltipon, I personally and we like a lot to diversify and work with them as well. We're pretty strong on Apple and Netflix, and there are others coming. It doesn't necessarily cannibalize your free-to-play efforts.
Talking about something you said, Kalle, and it's something we've discussed in previous podcasts, which I think is sort of interesting. And it's the you mentioned sort of in Japan in particular, they're just like, the vast majority is all about sort of collaborations, and that's sort of interesting, I think, because that's often games, sort of what could be seen as competitive, games that are competitive to each other, having sort of collabs all the time. So I don't know if you've got sort of any examples of that, but do you think that sort of when we talk about brands, we're not actually just talking about non-gaming brands? I mean, gaming brands are now sort of part of the mix, aren't they? So I don't know. I think it's probably still a very Japanese type thing, where you can have these sort of what would be seen as sort of competing companies having collaborations. But I mean, do you think that's something that we could see more generally? Where I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't know. I guess Call of Duty is not going to have a collab with Fortnite, or is it? Who knows? I mean, I guess if both of them feel like they're getting something out of it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And actually, just recently, the One Piece game, the One Piece Treasure Cruise in Japan, actually had a very very interesting game IP based collaboration event that sort of like relates to this. So in that collaboration event, players were incentivized to engage with also other mobile games. So I think there were like 5 to 6 different games like Monster Strike and Puzzle Dragons, for example. And these are not by the same publisher as One Piece. So this was not like a cross promotion event or anything like that. But in this event, players, if they were able to clear enough collaboration tasks in, let's say, Monster Strike or for, let's say, Puzzle and Dragons, players also got rewards in One Piece Treasure Cruise, and also vice versa. So if you were able to clear tasks in Treasure Cruise, rewards were distributed in those other games as well. So it was kind of like cross promo we see in other games, but it was in event format. And as I said, these games were not from the portfolio of a single publisher. So that was very interesting. We at least haven't seen that much in other games. And as you said, like game collaborations are very popular in Japan, and especially brands like Final Fantasy is something that you see collaborating in a lot of games there.
Ratchet, I don't know, what sort of trends are you seeing in terms of how people are using the platform? Is it sort of what you expected, or are you seeing anything that's sort of interesting in terms of the people using it in ways you didn't necessarily think they would be using it?
Yeah, good question. I think on the game collab space, I think it's interesting. We've recently started seeing a few mobile IPs where the games have characters that people like widely recognize. Start listing on layer to see, can we take this somewhere that isn't necessarily competitive, that like extends our reach and our kind of placement across the market. But I think generally looking at the kind of licensing trends that we see in general, I think the types of IP that are being licensed and how they're being licensed, are quite wide. I think talking to that point that Kale said earlier, with something like Garena or something like Cookie Run, like these are not necessarily IPs that would have necessarily made as much kind of sense maybe 10 years ago, or people wouldn't have expected it, is what I'm trying to say. I think, Cristiano Ronaldo with Garena, like you wouldn't think it would happen. And what we're, I think, seeing in that kind of licensing space, especially in the content space, is it's the audience that matters. It's, if that audience likes that and they're fans of Ronaldo, then it's likely to be a success. But if you try and put something in there that doesn't make any sense to that audience, or they don't even know it and there's no appeal to it, it's much harder to make that fly, even if it doesn't have to be in canon or narrative. In what we see in Leia, I mean, I think from our digging, so much of this IP space is so character driven. Characters resonate. Characters also lend themselves really well to being something that can really change user acquisition costs. It's something that people can identify with. Also for in-game monetization, it lends itself for skins, cosmetics, anything like that. So character-driven IP is where we see a lot of our kind of work. And then of course you've got traditional things as well that just like a kind of par for the course. If you're building a racing game, automotive licensing just makes sense because that's kind of like true to automotive racing and anything that's simulation. But outside of that, I'd say character is really where we see a lot of strength.
I mean, the racing one's interesting because that's happened over the last sort of decade, I suppose. But now you can't really get away with a racing game unless it's clearly a fantasy racing game. People, if it's like a real world thing, people expect you to have some proper brands in there. You'd be seen as like you're not a proper quality product if you don't have. You don't have to have everything, obviously, but it's sort of interesting. I think that was the first sort of sub sort of genre in the industry where the car manufacturers got really big on we can launching cars in computer games and stuff like that, and that you could just see it was so sort of pure for both sides that it would work out well. The Cristiano Ronaldo one is one we've discussed in the podcast sort of previously. It's funny because we talk about it so much, so everyone noticed it. I would love to have some data on whether that worked. That just seems such an odd sort of collaboration. But maybe as you say, it's sort of there isn't any canon. So by putting Cristiano Ronaldo in a shooting game,
now there's a Neymar collaboration with the game Mech Arena going on. and it's like I just heard from my colleague that it's really well made, and and the character name that you can get in the game is actually really powerful one, and I think you could get it from logging into the game for 7 days in a row or something like that.
Without falling down my favorite rabbit hole, it is interesting that Neymar, I guess, I think as a sort of a brand in of himself is a bit wider than Cristiano Ronaldo. Is like obviously one of the world's best footballers ever, but he doesn't really seem to have much outside of soccer. Whereas Neymar, I think he loves his NFTs, and there's a bit more sort of broadness to him, I think. Anyway, let's leave that one alone. Asi, I mean, you guys are, I don't know how much you can talk about this actually, but you guys are currently working with Netflix. So on a very broad scale, in some ways, I guess that's a very traditional games licensor sort of relationship, or is it? I don't know. I mean, obviously Netflix has tons of IP and probably is quite open to doing some interesting stuff.
It might be surprising when you really go deep into the IP world, where you would assume that Netflix, for example, owns a certain IP, but in reality, it's owned by a movie production studio that actually made it for Netflix. So that happens with some of our titles. In that case, what happens is a very complex deal. Think about it as a four-party deal. Okay, we have a developer that made the original engine. We have Tilting Point as a publisher. We have a licensor that, even though they work with Netflix, they own the IP, and we have Netflix as a platform for the distribution. So you need to basically satisfy all of them. Obviously, it helps when the licensor and Netflix work together in the past. It does make things easier, but it's still a separate deal. And it happened to us already in at least one case with Netflix.
That's a very good point. I'm by no means an expert on that sort of thing, but you have these sort of licenses and sub licenses, and then I guess the famous one, certainly in the not the game space, but it's affected the game space is something like The Walking Dead, where you have originally a comic book, then a TV series, and you have different licensors, so you have different games, and they can all only the ones with AMC can show the actors' faces.
Yeah. We worked with that license, and it's you can work with the TV show producers, and you can work with the comic book, graphic novel writers, and it's a different license.
And Rashid, I'm sure there's many more examples of horrible complexity. I mean, I guess that's what your platform's supposed to deal with. I mean, can it deal with it, or are there things so complex that you basically can't really design for them?
This is a space where there is negotiations, and it's these deals don't happen like an online marketplace where you just add it to your cart and check out, right? This isn't, you're not just buying groceries. So there is a back and forth, and we are always trying to get our licenses and our licensees talking together, making sure that the rights are available in the right way, that we know that if it's a comic book IP and it's had a film made, can we access that? Because if we can access that, maybe it changes how they're going to work with the game. And if they can't, maybe they've got to consider the narrative that's available from the comic book series. So no, it's definitely part of it, and I think that's something that's very hard right now to automate. We love that back and forth, and we know that's part of it, and it also is I think part of making sure that the licensor feels comfortable that you're respecting that IP, that franchise, and everything that they can and can't do. So no, we don't necessarily standardize that entirely, but we try and get as much of the work done, in the lead up to that, to make sure that you can have more of those discussions. I think if you think about most of the market, most developers, most publishers aren't even having those discussions with licensors, and aren't in that room. And so if we can get more people to that point, if they're really two parties that do want to work together, I think that's a positive outcome, because in that case they'll generally try and get to that win-win situation for each side.
A marketplace where I guess there's a lot of demand from developers who are at least interested to see what's there. And I just want to more generally, have you found sort of the supply side, which could be, we've said brands are really interested in sort of get their stuff licensed, but I guess you want quite a range of brands. You don't want sort of one sort of brand. So have you found the platform being something that sort of brands are actually sort of quite interested in, or has it been a bit more of a sort of like a education process going on there?
There's a bit of both. We work with a couple hundred IPs at the moment, and so it's quite wide ranging. It goes from characters, film and TV, to consumer brands, automotive, through to like individual talent and celebrity types as well. And so I think whilst everyone is protective about making sure that everything is respected and done in the right way, I think most people are really starting to understand and are quite aware how big the gaming market is, right? And so if you're a forward-thinking licensor, you have to try and figure out how do we make sure that we set our IP up, our properties up to be in that space where the audience is. IP has gaming has changed so much over, say, like the last couple of decades, that the amount of players, the types of players is so broad. It's very much mainstream media. And so if you're not there, you're probably putting your own IP at risk by not keeping it relevant. And so I think we're seeing really, really positive things overall.
Good. Well, thank you very much to everyone for the discussion today. I think we've covered a lot of stuff as ever. Sort of, I guess, only sort of scratching the surface with these sort of very in-depth topics, but it's good. And I guess your homework for today is to go and check out Layer Licensing and see if there's something there that sort of piques your fancy. So thank you very much to Ratchet and Asi and Kele.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to you for watching or listening to the podcast, however you're consuming it. Please subscribe by your platform of choice. Every episode, we're talking to people who are building out these really sort of interesting new models in the mobile space, which, as we all know, never cease to tell people is the biggest part of gaming, although some of the other people in gaming don't seem to recognise that still. But there we go. So mobile is where it's all happening. So please subscribe to the podcast and look forward to seeing you next time. See ya.